Um, okay, so we've made it to the end. It's really remarkable while I was going back and taking a look at where we've been. Just like not just the immense amount of material we've covered, but hopefully, I hope what people have found is um, an immense amount of thought and different ways of looking at a really intricate and complex issue. And I shared that in addition to this being a request that people were interested in learning that like I one of the reasons I am um, interested in this topic is how good of an example it is of kind of the evolution of Jewish practice, and in a way that I think is um, challenging. I've tried not to hide kind of my perspective that when you look at these sources and you look at the way of thinking about what it means to be tznius, it's very clear that it has. Um, I think it has been corrupted. And when I say that, that's not like something that I've independently come to on my own. I've learned that, right? Like I've learned that from other teachers, women who practice tznius, who have pointed at this and said, "Hey, this is problematic, not just because we don't like it, but because when you actually go back to the sources, you see a different and an original vision of this." And so that for me, I'm very grateful that this was asked to be an area of focus because for me, that's kind of the whole point of studying our texts, right? Is gaining a sense of what a deep sense of what has been bequeathed to us and what responsibility we have to push it forward. And while I imagine that most of us in this learning certainly don't follow the strictures of tznius as they are practiced in other communities. My hope is that the learning has also kind of given some new thought about what it might mean to adopt a hashkafa, an outlook that understands kind of the role of how we want to portray ourselves in the world and how we want to act towards others and what kind of spiritual awareness we want to bring to the world. So that's where that's kind of like my thesis capstone. Our learning today and then over the 2 additional weeks is really just to do a rather broad look at, well, look, what does this actually look like in practice today for people who are in communities such as this, and then to give us an opportunity to think a little bit about how has it changed, why does it look the way it does, and to look at some voices um, who are both in favor of a more stringent approach to this and those who are opposed to it and who are looking for a more lenient approach on this. So what I'm going to do is my plan is to move a little bit quickly through the overview of kind of the evolution of this because I think we all kind of know where this comes from now and we're all really great at understanding the core sources on this, and so we'll move a little bit speedy on that, and then that should give us some time to dwell a little bit more on the contemporary practice pieces. And my plan is that anything that we kind of move quickly through, we'll have the opportunity over the additional sessions to kind of come back and sit more deeply with. Does that sound okay to everyone? Great. Okay. So new sources, I shared them out yesterday. I will put them up on the screen, of course. And let's take a look at this. So, Paul, if we go back to what we learned early on about erva, right? This term that is sometimes translated as nakedness, but when we looked at it, it was really, we learned a little bit more that it is not about kind of an opposition to nudity as a whole, but it is really confined to kind of what parts of the body that if they were exposed would prohibit you from saying Shema, right? If you were in the presence of them. And that was like a very, very narrow definition, certainly in its original sense. And what we're going to look at and see how that gets expanded, right? And how the tradition really starts to take that core idea and build it into something much bigger than it originally was. And one of the things I want to say is we look at this and we're going to get into like questions of like, well, like how much of a body being shown is okay, and sometimes it's really down to like centimeters. And what I want to say is I want to be careful about how we present the specifics, like the hyper specifics of sneed when it comes to clothes and like parts of the body being exposed. I'm not in those communities, right? I'm not embedded amongst the people who practice that. So I don't have any experience in really understanding how those minutiae get delineated. I know that they do, but I don't know how individual people and rabbis and communities are measuring that out. So I'm going to stay away from that. Like I don't feel like I have the ability to answer questions on why is this okay in one place and one and in another. What I do know and what we do know is we know the core texts, right? We understand what are the values and ideas behind all of these. So that's why I want to keep to a bit of a broader overview of all of this. So let's look at how the Talmud widens what had been a rather narrow case. Okay, Angel, can you kick us off with this first text from the Talmud from Tractate Brachot?
Sorry, I have a lot of noise in the background.
Oh, you sound great to us. I can hear you pretty clearly.
Oh, okay. It's just the mic pop up. So Rabbi Yitzhak said can't see that word.
Tefach.
Tefach of a woman is erva. With respect to what? If you say for looking at her, behold, Rab Sheshet says, whoever looks for pleasure, that a woman's little finger is like one who looks at her genitalia. Rather, the tefach applies to his wife and for kriyat shema.
Okay, so a tefach is a hand's breadth. It's a biblical and a Talmudic unit of measurement. And look, already you can see when we looked at erva, it was in a very confined case. And now you have Rav Yitzchak say, quoting Rav Sheshet, two different rabbis, that it's not about one particular part of the body. It's about any exposed part of the body, right? Even a finger. And previously, hands have been fine, right? There's been no mention that looking at kind of exposed hands has anything to do necessarily with this. And Rav Sheshet says it's as if you're looking at a naked woman's body, right? Just looking at her finger. So there's an expansion there, both in size and in content. And then you have it seems to be the anonymous narrator of the Talmud in this last sentence. It might be Rav Yitzchak, but it also just might be the narrator of the Talmud saying it's not any woman, it's only his wife, right? And it's trying to constrict us back again and saying, and this isn't all the time. This is just like, you can't look at your wife's finger while you're about to say Shema. I just want to say, like, if this has been held true, then like all of my Shmas for the past 10 years have been invalidated because they're usually around my wife and her hand. So do people see what's happening there? How there's like this attempt to like both balloon it and then also perhaps constrict it back in. And then there's a question of to whom does this apply? Is this all women or is this just your wife? And I'm curious to hear what people think about like that dichotomy. Yeah, Carla.
I was going to say, isn't it more about the intent? You know, you're looking at your wife to check that she's got what she needs or something. And so you see her like it says for pleasure. That's in brackets. So that's somebody's interpretation. But I think
that's right. That's Steinsaltz's interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm thinking that this is about intent rather than what you happen to see.
So that might be a part of it. Let's come back to that after. Mom, you've got your hand up also.
Yeah, the way I'm reading it is do not look at women other than your wife at all. Like even a little finger is, you know, that's too much. So you should not look at any exposed part of any of women other than your wife. Your wife, you have a little bit of leeway. You can look at this much of your wife's exposed skin.
You can look at more. No, with your wife, you can look at more. It's just not during Shema.
I understand.
Yeah.
So the question is, you know, I guess the question is, how does this extrapolate beyond the Shema into daily life?
Great. Yeah. Right, exactly. So that once you start expanding it out, right, which Rav Yitzchak and Rav Sheshet are trying to do, it can balloon very quickly. There appears to be then this other voice that says, "Hold on, no, this is a much more limited case." And I think your point is similar to, or related to Carla's, in that if it's particular to a relationship, then yes, intent probably has a play in it, right? Because you're allowed to do that with your wife, but not with everybody else. So looking at another woman's pinky is as if you're intending to treat her as if she is kind of part of your close circle when she's actually not.
Right. But it's also it's saying it's also saying to me that a woman other than your wife is a greater source of distraction, temptation than
Yeah,
your wife.
maybe. Yeah.
It doesn't
In
put a lot
general, right?
in.
Both are still off limits during Shema, right?
Right, right. I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't put a lot of faith in men's ability to control
No,
themselves.
it doesn't. And if you rewind, and this is why we built in all of the pieces earlier, when you understand that all of this is supposed to be applicable to everyone, right? And how we all carry ourselves, there is a it's not unproblematic in how it has evolved in practice to today, where it has like a very low assumption of the conduct of men and then places all of the burden on women. Yeah. Don and then Alex, and then let's see how this evolves through the ages.
Yeah, you actually just said almost exactly what I was going to say, that all of a sudden the burden falls on the women rather than on the men to control themselves. But the other question I have is, does this not deny normal bodily function? Like looking at a woman or looking at a man or somebody that you might find attractive is a normal everyday urge. It's in nature.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah,
something that we should strive to. Well, I mean, obviously, anything done in excess can be problematic, but that's not what we're talking here. We're talking about something, looking at a woman's finger for fear you might be aroused, right? And
yeah,
there is some complications with basic natural uh,
yeah.
right urge there.
That's
But
right. So
I
think
have,
about
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no. So remember, this is one text, right? Presenting one view. It's shared by a few people, right? And so the question is, what do you build out of this text? Because there's plenty of other sources that reflect exactly the worldview that you just shared. They're like, no, this is normal, and you're supposed to delight in each other. Um, and so if you only go towards the most restrictive text, if you only go towards the most conservative points of view, that's a choice that people are entitled to make. But the question then you have to ask is exactly what you did. What do you do with all of these other sources that say that this is okay, right?
And
How do you
and
how do you put together your matrix of values?
and it also denies a woman's natural urge, right? It's only worrying here about what the man feels. It doesn't,
Right.
like,
Yes.
as we have learned, women have a place in sexual relations. It's not
Yeah.
just a male experience. So we have to, this denies women their autonomy
I
in
think you're
almost,
right. And that perspective is reflected less, right? Because of who's compiling the Talmud, right? So that we're not going to get perhaps as closer a reflection. But the other part we do, right? The idea that there is a much less restrictive version here. Alex Vanix, and then we're going to read text number 2.
Two thoughts. One is about what Don said. Actually, the restriction is on the man, not on the woman. You know, women don't seem to be restricted to even watch sorry, a man's little finger. Men are. Um, and maybe it is as aptly put by, where did she go? Oh, here, Karen. Sorry, I lost you. That men are more difficult to control them. Sorry, find it harder to control themselves than women. Who knows?
Yeah.
But the real thing that I wanted to explore here is, if you follow this to the T, the modern society is kaput. You know, you cannot go, you know, I, a man, cannot go to the street, okay, because I am going to see way more than a little pinky.
Yeah.
Women that are not my.
Okay, great. So stick with that. Vanex, I promise we'll come back to you. Alex, will you read the second text? Because that addresses
Sure.
exactly what you're saying. I just want to tell people who this is. This is Asher ben Yechiel, who's known as the Rosh. And he is the father of Yaakov ben Asher. And Yaakov ben Asher wrote the Tur, which we've looked at, the Arba Turim, whose structure kind of was the four major sections of halachic practice. So the Rosh is the father of Yaakov ben Asher, and Yaakov ben Asher wrote the Tur, which gave us the outline of basically all halachic texts and responsa literature up to this day. That's who he is. We've seen his text before. We've seen his son quote on who he is. He lives in 13th and 14th century Toledo. Okay, Alex, just read what he says.
A tefach of a woman is nakedness, erva, meaning that which is typically covered in a woman. If a tefach of it is uncovered, that is considered erva.
Okay, so how does he expand, and how does he limit his expansion here?
Of any woman, not just the wife, is the expansion. Yeah. And the restriction is only that parts that are typically covered. Right.
So he's broadening this, and he basically agrees with the piece of Talmud, and he says, like, this applies to anyone. It's not just your wife, right? This is anyone. And he agrees that it's erva, right? Which we know, at least in its core in the text, was not the case, right? That was a very limited piece just related to when you can say the Shema. But he then limits that with this piece that I think is important when he says mashragil lihiyot, right? That which is regular, normal. So if you live in a contemporary society where it's much normal for people to be walking around in short sleeves and pants and shorts, I think, you can't make necessarily the case that, like, okay, that just gives you carte blanche. But you're seeing here in his articulation of this something that reflects a lot of the text that we said, where you have to consider what the normative practice is in the place where you are. And we certainly, most of us, don't live in communities where there's the kind of restriction that Rabbi Yitzchak and Rav Sheshet are trying to apply. So, Alex, I think you see in the Rosh's comment here a similar consciousness of, like, yeah, okay, fine, but, like, what are people actually doing? Okay, Vanix.
I think this goes back to a lot of what we talked about earlier with respect to the norms of the community. Hashkafa, is that the right word?
Yeah, hashkafa.
I wanted to ask a question, and it may sound naive, but the last sentence in the first the Talmud quote, and for Kiryat Shema, if you're supposed to say the Shema when you first wake up and before you go to bed, then when would this apply? In other words, this is all during the day. I'm talking about during the day.
Yeah, it's such a good question, because it hyperlinks us over to the very first page of the Talmud that asks, hey, when the Torah says when you lie down and when you rise up, what does that mean? Does it literally mean lying down in bed? And does it literally mean rising up in the morning? Or is that just referring to, like, certain blocks of time, right? This is the first question the Talmud asks, right? When do you say the Shema? And so Peter, you're raising such a great it's not really a paradox, but there's some intertextuality here, and that if you are among the people who assume that when the Torah says when you lie down, it literally means when you lie down, meaning lying down in bed, closing your eyes, going to bed, then perhaps this text here from Brachot raises a bit of a challenge, right? However, if you're amongst the other view, which is basically normative, that when you lie down doesn't literally mean at bedtime, it means at kind of like in that chunk of the day, then you're a little bit easier. But it's a great example of how all of this stuff starts to like fit together, and you have to kind of like cobble together, like, what does a day look like, right? How do you set the course of your day? And if you're somebody who is looking to halachic practice to really guide like minute to minute, moment to moment, then that's a great question, right? How do you smush these two together? So I don't think it's naive at all.
But a lot of us spend quite a length of time studying brachot with Rabbi Streifer, and the upshot of what I remember, I have a great memory, but it's short. The upshot of what I remember about when you say the Shema as defined in brachot was basically first thing in the morning, which I think was agreed upon throughout the text that we studied. But yeah, the evening one is a little less clear, but it's still the evening before you go to bed or when you go to bed. But it's not when you're out with friends in the evening.
Yeah. The normative, just to close off the when do you say Shema, because that's actually a good important question, right? Like halachic time is divided up a little bit differently than our clock is, and even though our clock is based on Babylonian time, there's like a window of time in the evening, like the earliest moment when you can say Shema for its account, and the latest moment you can say Shema for its account. Right. Okay. So there's a question here that we started talking about. What does his wife mean, right? What does the Talmud mean when it says the tefach applies to his wife? There's two ways really of understanding it. One way is to say that erva in the context of Shema is something you have to avoid, even if it's your wife, right? Right? Meaning you're allowed to see a tefach of any woman exposed at any time, including your wife. The other way of looking at that is that the tefach only applies if it's your wife, meaning everybody else you can't look at ever, right? Even less than a tefach, you can't look at them. But your wife you can, but not during Shema, right? So there's like a more conservative and then a more open way of looking at it. And you can see both of those in our next text from the Shulchan Aruch. Mom, will you read this? An exposed tefach.
An exposed tefach of a woman in a place that she usually covers, even if it is his wife, would be forbidden to recite Kriyat Shema before it.
Okay, so that's Caro, right? That's Joseph Caro. And look, he's building on who? On the Rosh, right? He's taking what the Rosh said, and he adds back in a commentary. He's pulling from the Talmud, right, with his more restrictive view on that, and says, even if it's your wife, you're not allowed to look at it, right? But then look what the Ramah says, and here you get the lovely like Sephardi versus Ashkenazi debate.
Some say specifically with his wife, but with regard to another woman, even less than a tefach would be considered erva.
And that's, you can't look at anyone, right? Like, no, you're not allowed to look kind of over there, even less than a tefach. So this is like a really great example again of like, why do you need to bring in kind of extra halachic things like hashkafa? Why do you need to consider your worldview and the breadth of values and opinions that are out there? Because at least just looking at the Talmud on it, when it says the tefach applies to his wife, does that mean you're allowed to look at a tefach of your wife, or does that mean you're not allowed to look at a tefach of your wife? Right? Not entirely clear. And you can see in Caro and the Ramah the back and forth there. Vanix, yeah.
Jesse, is this the start of the division when one is in synagogue where the men are in one section, the women in another, and they can't see one another?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the idea of a mechitza, like the barrier between the men and the women, all comes from here, right? It all comes. It's not. This is not this like. You can't pinpoint the exact start to something like that. We certainly find evidence of that in early synagogues. Um, this is, but it's all built on this idea, right, of like creating a space for the men to be able to say Shema because they're, it's incumbent upon them, right? Okay. So now that we've seen how erva gets expanded out, right, we can also see that there are other um, there are other things that get expanded and broadened in terms of what's applicable. Okay, our meeting is going to end in 10 minutes. I just got a notice of that, so we'll log back in and hopefully it'll be okay. If we're not, keep an eye on your email and I'll send a new link out. Okay, so let's see what else gets expanded here. Dawn, can you read this other text from Brachos?
Rav Chisda
And
said,
the
a
Hebrew
woman.
word is shok, and we'll try and figure out what that is.
Okay, Rav Chisda said, a woman's shok is erva. As it is written, reveal your shok and cross rivers. And then it is written, expose your erva and your shame will also be seen.
Oh, okay, and I messed up Isaiah here. My apologies to the prophet. So a shok is part of the leg. We know that much. And here we're seeing this classic rabbinic mode of interpretation of being able to take two concepts, and when they appear close to each other in the Tanakh, you can draw inferences from those. So, of course, we should go and actually read what's going on in the source. I'm anticipating frustration from Peter at why are they allowed to do this? It's going to happen. It's going to be okay. But one of the things to remember is that even though Isaiah is not at all talking about the halachic minutiae of how much of a woman's leg can be exposed, the rabbis use those sources as inspiration to guide the conversation that they're having, right? Okay. So, Don, why don't you read from Isaiah? This is God talking to the Babylonians, saying, yeah, you had your fun, you exiled my people, but don't get too comfortable because I'm coming for you and nobody's going to help you out.
Okay, I will read this, but I'm starting to think that they're reverse engineering it. And that's a problem for me.
Oh, totally. Absolutely. Yeah. But it's done with integrity. Yeah.
Well, we can have that conversation later.
Separate conversation. Yeah. Okay. Let's read Isaiah.
Get down, sit in the dust, fair maiden Babylon. Sit dethroned on the ground, O fair Chaldea. Nevermore shall they call you the tender and dainty one. Grasp the hand mill and grind meal, remove your veil, strip off your train, bare your leg, wade through the rivers. You're going to have to lift it up a little bit. Your nakedness shall be uncovered and your shame shall be exposed. I will take vengeance and let no one intercede.
Okay. Beautiful biblical poetry here. This is, God coming back to our defense and really laying it thick on the Babylonians. So again, this is first of all, it's very clearly poetry, right? That's why it's structured this way. This is JPS's translation, and it's written this way because it's very clearly poetry. It's filled with metaphor, right, and imagery. Very, 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 very obviously in Tanakh, not actually about saying how much leg are you allowed to show, right? But let's see how it's used, right? Right? There's, I guess it should be said, right, that like there's also like probably a challenging view here where like Babylon is portrayed as kind of like a harlot. And that's an inverse of sometimes how Israel is portrayed also. That's a separate class on biblical poetry that is less outside of my area of expertise. But very clearly, right, there's this idea here of gali shok, bare your leg. And then in the next sentence, it says tigal erva, right? Ervatech. So legs and nakedness legs and erva get associated with each other here in Isaiah. And that's where Rav Chisda says, oh, Rav Chisda reads this as poetry also. He sees the mirror imagery here and he says very clearly, like, oh, the leg is described as erva. And then he's allowed to extrapolate that and understand that in the context of his commentary in the Talmud. Vanix and then Alex.
Sorry, Jesse, I just forgot to lower her hand.
Oh, okay, yeah. Alex, go for it. Oh, sorry, we can't hear you. Just unmute.
Sorry. I think that the use of the way through the rivers, burial legs, etc., and the nakedness is pulled. It's pulled a little bit out of context. I may be
Oh,
misinterpreting.
yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because one is, free yourself, and the other is, it's about the role that God will take in defending the children of Israel from the Chaldeans and the Babylonians.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a little bit
However,
not entirely out of context, but I think that is pushing the interpretation.
it's definitely, yeah. I mean, which is part of the fun of the system, right? Of like, where can I look in my canon for the metaphors that are inspiring and powerful? And while we would probably say it's probably not the metaphor that I want to be drawing upon to construct like how I conduct, my dress and my sense of modesty in the world, it certainly is where Rav Pista is going. Yeah. Mom.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Isaiah verses. Babylon is portrayed as Betula, right? Which is a word for virgin. Is that
A
correct?
virgin, yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's
Fair
some,
maiden. Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah.
there's, which is kind of weird since Babylon is anything but
Well, that's
if
the
you,
whole point, right? Like
right, so
it's God's being kind of tongue in cheek here.
yeah. So, but if you take that metaphor of a virgin being deflowered, to use a very old expression, because you see the expression your nakedness shall be uncovered, which is a euphemism for
Hmm.
sex. We see that with Noah, right, for example.
Hmm.
Um, so this is maybe taking it a little far, but this is the rape of a virgin because she's naked. So this is something about if you take your
Mm.
clothes off, you are defenseless. So you could see that the rabbis are sort of thinking women are exposing themselves to potential sexual violence if they show too much skin,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is, kind of a misguided blame the victim approach how that's how we would frame it. But I
Yeah.
think there is this sense of defending women's honor.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, yeah. Yeah. And thank you for pointing that out because, you might want to say to Rav Krista, if you could talk to him, like, so you're comparing Jewish women to Babylon, like, is that the upshot of what you want to do here? And then saying that like they're getting what's coming to them, right? Like that's yeah,
Yeah,
it's a tough one. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, I can't imagine that was his. Although,
definitely not.
I mean, certainly there's plenty in rabbinic literature about, the dangers of women, right?
Yeah,
So
I don't think. I
that's
mean,
not
so
where
what you
that's
might
not
want to
where
do is like look at Rav Chisda and everything that he says and figure out what's his hashkafa and like how does he understand everything here? Yeah. Um. Uh. Yeah, and I imagine that like whenever you use a metaphor, you can always push the metaphor too far, right? Eventually you reach the limits of it. And so the limits here are not that like, oh, and therefore Israel, Jewish women are like the Babylonians. No, like you've gone too far. The metaphor is really limited to the body parts, right? And I think that's how it's meant to function. Dawn, you've got a minute and a half on the clock here, and then we're gonna
I
have to
can see
log back
it's
in.
ticking down.
Yeah.
I disagree, Karen. Sorry. I have a hard time buying this idea that they're protecting women's honor as opposed to defending men from the potentiality of sin. And I think that it's far more likely that they're trying to protect themselves in this conversation rather than defend a woman's honor. That's just my feeling.
Yeah, I think they probably would sort of hide behind that curtain of oh, we're just protecting you.
Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree with you, John. I mean, I think it's kind of both.
again, I think it's been reverse engineered to make it that way, so. Okay, how are
Right,
we
which is
doing?
why,
Go ahead.
like, ideally, we are asking these kinds of questions when we look at these sources and not just taking them as face value. And if it's true that they're, reverse engineering. By the way, the rabbis have a term for like the negative form of reverse engineering, where you're really just kind of like searching through the whole canon to find like the one text that backs you up, and then calling it out and saying, "See, I'm right." And they tend to look, you can do that, but they tend to look not so pleasingly on that. The other way to do it is to record. Okay. And I need to share the screen.
Repeat that.
Technology. Yeah, one way of doing the like reverse engineering that some of us are pointing out here is that, oh, they're just like cherry picking and what they want to look at. And to an extent, the rabbis understand that that's going to happen sometimes. But the other way of doing it is saying, like, yes, I'm looking back into our tradition to find the sources that seem to support the way I'm looking at the world. And they aren't pulled entirely out of context. They fit into a much broader system, right? Because the only way to avoid that at all is to just adopt a fundamentalist literal point of view of the text, which is just not the rabbinic tradition, right? That's not what we do. Okay, so let's look at one other example of how the text is expanded, or rather the practice is expanded. And this is actually a text that we've looked at a little bit before. So we've looked at kind of like the body as a whole, we've looked at the leg, and now let's look at a part of the body called the zroa. And did I... Are we there yet? What's going on here? Oh, hang on a second. I think I've cut out a little bit of text here in my note. Yeah, I just put the heading in the wrong place. I apologize for that. So now we're going to look at a part of the body called the zroa, which is the arms. So Carla, will you read from text number 7? This is from we're back in the Talmud here.
She spins in the marketplace. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, when she displayed.
Carla, can you move closer to your microphone? We can't hear you at all.
Okay, sorry. She spins in the marketplace. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, when she displays her zeraot arms to people.
Okay, so we looked at this a while back. There's this prohibition. Well, it's not a prohibition, but there's a concern with women who are spinning on their looms in the marketplace. Why? Because they might bear arms, right? So that might seem rather innocuous to many people today, but there are other Talmudic texts that are worried about that you might see into like the torso. It's not specifically about the arms, but about what else might be revealed. And by the way, that this is also important for men. And there's an idea also dating rather far back that wearing shirt sleeves when leading prayer is more respectable and dignified. And by the way, like this is, I know we live in the era of like athleisure wear, but we're also still in a time that understands that like wearing a shirt with sleeves is more appropriate for certain settings that you're going to find yourself in. And the Shulchan Aruch says that also. Carla, will you read this one also here?
i.e., one whose garment is torn and his arms revealed, should not lead prayer.
Right. So the idea being like there is something about the act of prayer that requires a more elevated form of dress. So that's not exclusively to women, but also for men.
Can I bring something sort of relevant a little bit?
Please, yeah.
I'm just having this conversation with some other teachers at school. Okay.
Yeah.
A student came into my classroom with a bare midriff. And that was against the breastplate policy. So I sent her down to the office and I said, they've got some long t-shirts in there that you can put one on, wear it for the rest of the day, and tomorrow you'll come to school dressed appropriately. The kid comes back wearing the same bare midriff. And she said, they didn't make me change. I called down to the office and I said, what's going on? Why did you send Leanne back? And they said, she's fine so long as her nipples aren't showing. And I couldn't believe it. So the other teachers and I had this conversation about dressing modestly. And I mean, the other teachers said, okay, we're dealing with grade 8 boys here. They're like 13 and 14 years old. And one of the teachers said to the girls, took the girls aside and said, okay, these boys are getting 10 to 15 spontaneous erections a day. Do you want to be the person who is responsible for that? And all the girls are like, ew, ew, right? Then they started to think about how they were dressing a little bit. You couldn't get away with saying that these days. This would have been about 15 years ago. And the point was that even though we don't necessarily want to bury our kids in clothes and enforce modesty on them, we still want them to dress with a sense of propriety. And that is modesty. Even now, there has to be a middle ground, like some of this, wearing a wig, long sleeves in the summer and no pants and stuff. Maybe that's going too far, but there does have to be some modesty in some way.
Yeah.
Just maybe for self-respect.
Yeah. Well, it's wow, yeah, it's a lot. And it's very clearly still live. I hear from my teacher friends that like, oh, this like all the time. And it's just so interesting that you ended with self-respect, right? Because I think that's so much of what we have framed this is that really the Torah and the traditions, the core understanding of tznius is it's about you and your relationship with God and how you carry yourself in the world, right? That's what the piece in Micah is about. That's what the piece in Proverbs is about, and that's what like the core setting is. I don't envy administrators and teachers who have to police their students' clothing, but I would be and I would not bring a religious worldview necessarily into this in a secular setting, but I'd be really curious to think about like dat Yehudit and the accepted practices of a community of women, and to say like, how do you all as a group want to decide how to dress and behave? I'm certainly not going to wade into that. Vanix and Mom.
I think, first of all, I agree with Carla 110%. We had, when Noah was growing up, the 2 sets of clothing. The clothing that he wore to school, which was jeans and t-shirts and whatever. And then there were temple clothes. There needs to be a sense of, I'm going to use the word that Carla did, which is propriety, and a sense of place. I'm not opposed to people going out in, obviously I'm wearing shorts and a t-shirt right now. All right, I'm not opposed to people going out in shorts and t-shirts. That's fine. But to wear shorts and t-shirts in a place where it's not appropriate is not fine. And I think that's what this is saying.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that you said propriety. That is not a word that came up at all in our initial brainstorm months ago of how do we understand tznius? What does that word mean? So it's so interesting that we've kind of built that in and come to that. You also said a sense of place, right? Which is about local custom and what people are trying to figure out. Okay, let's go Mom and then Alex. And I'm just going to project on timing here that then we're going to finish this little section and then call it so that we can end here in this section of study.
I guess it's, and I think Don mentioned this in the text, that it's who defines propriety and appropriateness.
Right.
That's, I think when I was in grade 10, that was the first year that we were allowed to wear pants to school. When I was in grade 13, that was the first year we were allowed to wear jeans to school.
Wow, I
So,
didn't know that.
and now you wouldn't even think twice about it.
Yeah.
And the
In
sort
a secular setting.
Yeah, in a secular setting. And, as somebody who grew up in the 60s and 70s, time of hippies and free love and expression, self-expression and all of that stuff, part of me says, we should be able to wear whatever we want, whenever we want, wherever we want. And yet in my real life, I raised kids who know that there are certain ways to dress depending on the day of the week and who you're with and what you're doing and so on and so forth. We still have many schools, including most of the Hebrew day schools, that require uniforms. And so they have their own way of sort of monitoring appropriate dress. But it all goes back to hashkava, right? It all goes back to what a community decides is appropriate. And that's a moving target. That changes over time,
Sure.
back and forwards, right?
It changes over time. And if you are raising people in a worldview, right, where they view this as, this is part of how I look at myself and how I look at the world, and part of how I understand how to interpret our tradition, rather than these are the rules and these are the measurements, you have a much more, like, that's my bias on this, right? Is like, that's the world that I want to help people construct, is not where I'm just looking at a checklist to make sure that you add up to the requirements, but that maybe those requirements are even in my system, but that people understand it as a function of the values that we bring to how we look at the world and how we interpret our tradition. As an educator, that's my stamp of approval in that direction. Okay, let's go Alex, and then we'll finish off this section.
Yeah, actually, most of what I wanted to say was said already, but I just wanted to share an experience. When I was in elementary school in Argentina, the public school system did not have uniforms. However, we were supposed to wear like a coat lab, a white coat lab. Lab coat, excuse me, white. Every kid. It didn't matter whether you had midriff or 3 layers of sweaters. On top of everything, you had to wear that. It made class differentiation unnoticeable, right? And easy to identify a student in the streets as well, because they were wearing the coat. And I'm not sure whether the system still requires it today, but I thought it was an interesting choice at the time.
Yeah, I love that idea of like standardizing.
It was done for social reasons more than for.
Yeah. So interesting.
It actually covers that.
Okay, so we're just going to move quickly through this next piece, right? When we look at the text from Ketubot that I think Carla had just read, it says when she displays her zeraot, right? And so then the question is like, okay, like, that your arm is like, has different sections, right? So the question is like, how do we actually define that and understand it? Now, here's a text that I imagine lots of people are quite familiar with. John, will you read from Deuteronomy?
And God took us out of Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, Zroa, and with great awe and with signs and with wonders.
Okay, so we know in the Torah, right, that the Zroa, it's the whole arm, right? It's part of like the metaphor there. It's this image of God redeeming us from Egypt right there. But we actually have this Mishnah that's discussing human anatomy that seems to limit what Zroa refers to. This is from the tractate of Mishnah called Ohalot. Ohalot, which I don't think we've ever looked at before, discusses the ritual impurity of corpses and this quality that dead bodies have to make all objects in the same tent impure. Ohalot means tents. And so if you have a dead body in a tent, then everything in the tent becomes ritually impure. That's just the section of the Mishnah we're in. Doesn't really have anything to do with, well, I guess it does relate to the text. Don, will you just read this Mishnah?
Sure. There are 248 limbs in a human being, 2 in the lower arm, 2 in the elbow, 1 in the zeroa, upper arm, and 4 in the shoulder.
So you see how we can extrapolate this in this mission? It's very clear that we're going lower elbow, upper shoulder, right? And so by the time you get to the Mishnah, the Zroa does not mean the whole arm. It just means up here. Why is this important? Well, because if you're getting into the business of measuring centimeters, how you define that term actually has a direct impact on where your lines are going. Now, as I said at the beginning, I'm not sharing this to say, well, one community thinks this and another community thinks. It's just to help us remind ourselves that it's not cut and dry, that there's one version of how people are meant to dress that comes out of our tradition, that you really need to build that worldview and then bring that and apply it in a way that for you and your community feels as though it has integrity. I'm going to show just one thing in the text, just in case there's people who can't make it to the last two, and then we'll go to you and your question, Mom. If you're not going to be here in July, the last two things in this text, in the text package, are these two graphics on snoot. I'm not endorsing these as how one should practice, but I just want to tell you where they come from. They come from an organization called Derachecha, which means your way. And it's in the feminine in Hebrew, and they're an institute based in Israel, largely with Anglos, that's based on kind of women's halacha. A lot of the learning and a lot of the sources that informed this class come from them, and so I just wanted to give you an example of how I think you can see a feminist or a women's directed approach to tznius for people who practice tznius in terms of more I don't know if I want to say strict, but like a stronger adherence to actual parameters around what you can dress. That there are women who are trying to define, or not trying, women who are defining that for themselves. And so I brought just some of those so that you can see some different ways of thinking about this from that perspective. Okay, let's go, Mom, and then we have a hard stop right at 10 o'clock. And hopefully we'll see a couple people the first 2 weeks of July.
I find it interesting that we use, or they're using body parts to measure. So the tefach is a hand's breadth, so I guess this way or this way, I'm not sure. And then the zeroa, this arm, this bone. And to me, that brings in a layer of subjectivity, because whose hand, whose bone are you using as the standard measurement?
Yeah.
Other places we have weights and measures that are very specific, right? I guess this is, partly because this is a system that's still developing, but it's on two levels. It's interesting that we use actual body parts to talk about body parts, to the exposure of body parts, and also that we're using body parts that differ from person to person.
That's so interesting, right? Right. That there's not a tefach, yes, it's based on the body, but it becomes a kind of a standard measurement. But like when you look at there's all sorts of people who try to figure out well, what is a tefach and how large is it, right? And you never get the exact amount, you get a range, right? This is before you had ISO and standard measurements and all of those things, right? But it's so interesting that you would think that if it was the amount of body you're exposing, you would appeal to a system of measurement that's bigger than, that's not your body. That's like something else. Yeah. But I think you're right. It does point to subjectivity.
Yeah, just occurred to me that I think that horses are still measured in hands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think many people are concerned with
No, but just that idea of using, and right, cubits, we think about cubits as being
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I missed the beginning. What's happening next week and the week after?
Yes. Okay, so just to remind folks of that, and so we're off next week. I've added in the first 2 weeks of July as just a rounding out, really, of kind of looking at some more contemporary voices on all of this for those who are interested. I really encourage you to be there. Would love to see people a little bit more. If you can't make it, I understand. We'll send out the recordings.
But not next week.
For everyone. No, next week we're off. And then we're off for the summer, and you'll hear back from the shul with plans for when we pick back up.
Yeah, and don't forget, if you have some ideas about what you'd like to learn in the fall,
quick questions. we've done now like 2 large units that have kind of really gone expansively into halacha and modern practice. If you want to kind of go back in and go back just to some really close Talmud study, that's cool too. But I'm really happy to hear from people what you're curious about and interested in. Otherwise, I'm just going to teach you what I want. Okay. Hope to see people soon. Have a great day. Shabbat shalom. And cheers.
I know.